Welcome to the CISSP Cyber Training Podcast, where we provide you the training and tools you need to pass the CISSP exam the first time. Hi, my name is Sean Gerber, and I'm your host for this action-packed, informative podcast. Join me each week as I provide the information you need to pass the CISSP exam and grow your cybersecurity knowledge. All right, let's get started. Hey, all, Sean Gerber with CISSP Cyber Training, and I hope that you all are having a great day today. Today is an amazing day here in the United States. Actually, the weather today has been beautiful. It's been gorgeous. The temperature's dropped off, so it's not like melting your face off. So things are amazing. I'm so excited about this. The fall's coming, and yeah, it's great. My brother just actually sent me pictures. He is in Innsbruck, Austria. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. So if you're over in Innsbruck, yeah, your country and your area is beautiful. Very, very pretty. But needless to say, you aren't here to talk about Innsbruck, Austria. You are here to talk about CISSP cyber training stuff, right? Yes, you are. And today we're going to be talking about the cloud. So this is probably one of the areas that has a lot of questions around because a lot of people don't necessarily deal with it. The standard VPN type communications and contacts and all of that type of data is well used and well understood. But as we get into the cloud, it is a new area, relatively speaking. And it's been around for quite a while, obviously, but it is in relationship to the normal networking stuff that you all deal with. It is relatively new. So we're going to get into some of these questions as it relates to, we'll actually first going to go over the cloud, and then next episode will be over some of the questions you may anticipate seeing on the CISSP exam. But we're just going to kind of touch on what are some key components that you need to know as it relates to the cloud. Now, this is domain 4 is what you'll be focused on. And the title of this obviously is Cloud Infrastructure in Network Components. And we're going to kind of go into the various components that are tied with the cloud. Okay, so let's get started. So as we're talking about the cloud service, there are some various models and the networking pieces that we have kind of brushed or talked about here on CISSP Cyber Training a couple of times, and they become a very important factor in the cloud. Now, when you take what you do from a networking standpoint in your day-to-day activities from a standard network, right? Your ACLs, which is your access control lists, your firewalls, your network switching, all of those pieces, they will transmit or transpose themselves to the cloud. Now, they may have some different terms that go with them, but in reality, they're very similar concepts because all you're really doing, if you kind of put your brain around this, and many of you may be much smarter on this than I am, but the aspect that comes into the cloud is you're just taking your data center that you would have at your business or at your location, and you're moving it to a third party. So the same concepts that you would have in your own networking data center, you have now within this various third parties data center. The differences is that they've had to come with a standard nomenclature on how can you manage these remote systems. And it's really the main difference is that you're developing a way to work with remote systems that are more or less doing the same thing you would do within your own data center at your location. And you're just basically taking the cost that you had from your own place and migrating that out to the cloud, out to a location in a third party. Now, the positives that come with this, obviously cost can be a driver and it can go down. However, in my experience with dealing with the cloud, the cost really is kind of a wash at this point. And what does that mean? It means the cost that you would just typically save by moving to a third party that's in a different location, that's the initial savings. But as you add more functionality to this environment, then your costs start to increase. And as your costs increase, what I've found is a fully deployed third party system, such as an AWS or Azure, is going to be very cost competitive to what you would have on your on-prem environment. So you're going to pay about the same. However, the difference is that you now have much more flexibility with the software to be able to do things that you really probably wouldn't do on-prem without having to, one, buy expensive software, or two, you just may not be able to get that opportunity. So it's really changed the way you can operate with this third-party data center. However, the downside on that, though, is you need people that are smart enough, that have got the experience, that can go and configure this third party, this environment, this cloud environment, in a way that will be useful. That's another issue that I've noticed. I've worked with some local churches on the various types of security, and there's one company out there that does media for basically they spread out how they spread their gospel. They use it in a media format. So there's a format that they have a cloud environment, they have a third-party environment, and then these basically churches can upload content. This content can be available. And the reason I tell you all that is because they're looking for a cloud engineer to help them with their overall setup. And this cloud engineer is an AWS cloud engineer. Well, they're hard to find. Now, this is a nonprofit, so they don't necessarily pay the kind of income that many cloud engineers out there are asking for and getting. So the point I'm trying to make with that is, as things are changing, the amount of technology and resources needed to be able to do this and the experience is going to continue to climb and to grow. Therefore, if you are a security person, then this kind of information was going to be very valuable to you. Okay, so let's get into the different cloud secure service models and the various networking pieces. So when we're going to talk about IaaS, so that's India Alpha Alpha Sierra, PAAS, which is Papa Alpha Alpha Sierra, and then SaaS, which is your Sierra Alpha Alpha Sierra. Okay, so IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. So infrastructure as a service is what you get when you move a lot of this information or a lot of this data up there to this cloud. And they have what they call a virtual private cloud. Now, this virtual private cloud is an isolated cloud-based network that is designed specifically for you. And this VPC, you can have multiple VPCs, but this VPC is designed as your overall infrastructure with your switches, your routers, all of those aspects. And they're done from a virtualized standpoint. So there is hardware, but this hardware is in their third-party data center, and it is virtualized to a point where it can be used amongst many, many people. So it's an opportunity for the company to be able to spend a lot of money on infrastructure, but that can be used among multiple companies. Now you have security groups. Now, what a security group, you'll hear this, especially as it relates to AWS. And I'll tell you, that's the one that I've worked primarily in. I don't really have a lot of experience in Azure. So if I do reference back to any sort of context, it would be the Amazon AWS environment. Now you have a thing called security groups. What these basically are is they're just a virtual firewall at the instance level. So when you have an instance, you have a virtual instance, they are acting as a firewall. They allow access in, they allow access out. You utilize basically an ACL, like your access control list. You will use an ACL to gain access. Now, what they do allow you for is much more granular access into the data that moves between the VPCs. And so it's important for you to understand that a traditional firewall can give you that level of granularity. However, look at it this way. If you have a Palo Alto firewall and you have a Fortinet firewall, well, how they configure those can be a bit different. Now, they still produce the same outcome, but how you would configure them would be potentially a little bit more different dashboards, different interfaces, and so forth. Well, the security groups is a one interface that allows you to make those granular changes to your network. So security groups are a very important aspect. Then you have a thing called network ACLs. These are virtual firewalls at the subnet level. So it's just basically now instead of having a routing table that would route from one area to another area, you can actually go and break this down even further and get into these network ACLs, these network access control lists that will then get very granular, where this computer can talk to this computer. This Lambda function can talk to this computer and to this subnet, or it cannot talk to any other than this one VPC, which would be a much larger group. So you can get very tight and very granular. So as you can see, the infrastructure as a service, it's just you're keeping the platform, it's being platform agnostic, which basically means you don't have to know Palo Altos, you don't have to know Fortinets, you just have to know the terms that are used within that environment and how to be able to configure those networks. Then there's platform as a service. Now this PaaS, this is where you have the platform itself has been designed and integrated within AWS. Now you have what they call service endpoints, and these integrate with the various networking components. Now you can have a setup where only this PaaS environment will work within this area. So as an example, let's go. If you have an application and this application is built on this platform, well, in the past you may have had to go out and buy all of the aspects that go with this. So maybe you had to buy the software, then you had to buy the hardware. This platform as a service basically has that all set up for you. So you now have your virtual networks embedded, you have your networking components embedded, and you have your software all built into this platform environment. And so it's taking it from an infrastructure standpoint down to a specific virtual platform. Now you can also go to the next level, which is your software as a service. Now this is where you get down into the specific software, and maybe that is the only thing running on this environment. Now we'll say you'll see more of the SaaS type environment, the software as a services, within the networks than you will see many other things, because it's easy for a developer. So let's just say I own a company and I have this really good software. Well, in the past, I would develop it on brand new servers, and then I would host it in the cloud, and then you would come to my server, you would be able to access it, and you would do whatever you do. And you come to the server, my software's on top. Now I just take that software, and instead of putting it on my own environment and on my own server, I now put that software in an AWS or Azure environment. And so now you have access to all the software you need. So my wife's Kona ice business, there is various software that we use and we log into, and that software then is running in the background, and it tells us what she needs to do to maintain her trucks, to maintain events, to go visit these events, scheduling employees. All of that is done through this software as a service product. Now we get into virtual network components. In a virtual network component, we have different levels to these. You have virtual switches, routers, and then cloud-based firewalls, which we kind of talked about a little bit. Now you have in your virtual switches, you have a thing called VLAN tagging. Now VLAN tagging is how you can a VLAN is a virtual LAN, and you can go in a traditional firewall and set up VLANs, and you can route that up or firewall or with switch, and you can set up a specific VLAN that your network can be segregated off to. Now you can do that with your virtual network components as well. But the nice part about using these VLANs within a virtual environment is it's much more standardized. So if I go to a Linksys firewall and set up a VLAN, how I set that up might be a little bit different than I would set it up on a Fortinet. And so therefore, this VLAN that you can do tagging, you can specifically tag traffic to go to specific VLANs. You don't have to have a lot of networking understanding to be able to do that. The other thing is traffic shaping you can do with your virtual switches. Now, the nice part about with the prioritization of this with traffic shaping is that you have a thing called QoS, which is your quality of service. You can, in a traditional switch, you'll set up QoS to work where it will prioritize the traffic for it to go to a certain location. Now, if you prioritize some traffic, so like I say at my church again, they have a wireless environment, and within the sanctuary, we want that QoS to be a certain level. When I have the people that are singing up front, I want them to have the maximum amount of bandwidth available to them, because it's important for that information to actually make it to the speakers. Whereas if somebody's surfing on their phone or looking at their Bible app or whatever they're doing in the sanctuary, that isn't as important as it is for me to send the data back and forth with the music. So therefore the QoS would be different. Same thing, you can do traffic shaping with these virtual systems that will allow the data to go in a way that you prioritize it over other data. And it gives you a real easy way to do that. Now, when you deal with virtual routers, again, you have also the ability to do dynamic routing. This will support for border gateway protocols, open short path frameworks. It'll also do all of those aspects that you would typically get within a normal networking environment. You can have within these virtual environments as well. You have high availability. There's a nice part about having it within the cloud is you can actually have the systems high available, which basically means if something were to go down, it will automatically roll over to something else. So you can have high availability set up in a failover situation for these routers versus having to go out in a traditional router that I have within our network. I may have multiple routers in place. I may have multiple firewalls in place because they're of physical firewalls, because if one was to fail and all the traffic's going through both firewalls, if one was to fail, it would fail open or it would fail over to the other firewall, allowing the traffic to pass through. Another one is cloud-based firewalls. They have various states. We have a stateful and a stateless firewalls. Those are all available to you in the cloud, and there's virtual implementation on how you would put those together. They have IDS, which is your intrusion detection and prevention systems, and then they also have deep packet inspections. So each of these things that we've talked about within the standard networking environments are available to you within the virtualized components. So all of that's out there, and it makes it really nice. So I'd highly recommend that you go out and you test it, play around with it, see what you can do. Now, when it comes to AWS, I do have some of my students are actually in college. You can, when I was teaching college at our local university, as a student, you can sign up for $100 of free credits with AWS. Now, we used it within the IoT core environment, but you can use it in other pieces of AWS as well. So I'd highly recommend you go out and just play with it, go use it, see what you can do. And then, but the key on this though is, and it's very inexpensive. Just don't forget about what you did, because you will have a bill at the end of the month. You can do a lot with $100 because most of these systems, when you set them up, it's all based on the amount of traffic that goes through them. And if you have very little traffic, you probably will never go through the $100 of free credit that they actually give you. Another area that you're going to see in the cloud that you talk about is a cloud access security brokers. Now, these CASBs, which you typically are talked about, CASB, Charlie Alpha Sierra Bravo, these CASBs are designed as a security broker that you can log into, and they give you a lot of capability just for what they can do. Another thing I forgot to mention is if you are listening to this or if you're watching it, you'll be able to see these video will be put on YouTube. It's also on CISSP Cyber Training, as well as some of the content that I'm talking about here. It's actually in a document form, so you can kind of look at that as well. But the cloud access security brokers, they are set up in a couple different ways, and they have API-based and they have proxy-based CASBs. Now, they really kind of comes down to is how does it fit within your network? An API-based CASB will allow any APIs to connect into it and be able to feed data, and then you'll be able to log into and see how that environment is working. Your proxy-based CASB is working from a proxy standpoint where now it's a proxy of your network. It's incorporated within your network, and now the data that is typically on-prem is now going to this proxy CASB. The nice part about the CASBs, and we'll get into those in a little bit, they give you this security appliance and the security dashboards that you typically wouldn't have unless you have invested in a very expensive product such as ArcSight or Splunk, something along those lines. It gives you that ability to turn knobs, flip switches, and to really truly understand the security posture of your environment. Another thing around CASBs that they can do is they can provide you data loss prevention, and it can scan the data before it leaves your network. So that's an important factor in this. I would say, I'm just going to point fingers at myself completely. There are ways that I'm not using CASBs as much as I should, and as I talk about this, I realize, oh yeah, you know what? I could probably use this in other ways within my own organization. So there's different aspects to think about as it relates to these tools, and you can use all of these tools like a Swiss Army knife, which basically means you flip open one blade and you have a blade. You flip over another part of the Swiss Army knife and you have a corkscrew. You flip over another one, you have a scissors. The point is that there's a lot of things you can do with these various tools. The key is one, doing the research and then truly understanding what the tool can give you. And I'd say that's probably one of the biggest challenges us security folks have, is understanding what each of these tools can do and how we can utilize them in a way that's effective and cost effective and reduces the risk for our organization. The other thing that CASBs can do is provide tokenization, which basically means if you're dealing with GDPR, you have to remove the sensitive data before you share that sensitive data with people. Well, the CASB can remove that or substitute that sensitive data before it's in transit. So it does give you the ability to anonymize data before it goes or leaves an environment. So it's a really great tool and a great capability that it has. Now, when we get into cloud storage, there's different types of storage within the cloud that you are going to be exposed to. You have object storage, you have block storage, and you have file storage. So your object storage, this is where you can have data replication. And this data can be copied across the network and across regions. It can also be copied across VPCs themselves. So it's the same type of situation you would run into on your on-prem network, but it can be done on a virtualized environment. You also have the ability to do data transmission with secure protocols such as HTTPS and SFTP. Now, we deal with HTTPS. You all have dealt with that from your web browsing. And SFTP is your secure file transport protocol. The nice thing is that setting up these SFTP connections and even using IPsec, which is your IPsec protocol, in the past has been very challenging. In the cloud environment, it's just a matter of clicking a few little buttons. It can be overwhelming on how to do it, but once you figure it out, it can be very, very intuitive and very easy. But it makes it much more capable, much more easy to be able to turn these kind of protocols on, where in the past, I would have to call a network engineer to make that IPsec connection between two systems. Now I can do it myself through the cloud. When you're dealing with block storage, there is the same type of thing you would do with your network, is you can attach and detach these different block storages to your virtual environment. And you can get these, you can basically say, I have a server, I want to add block storage to it, and it's a matter of just a few clicks and you have that already set up. Now, obviously the cost, it's not free, so the more storage you provide, the more it will cost you. But it is a very easy process by which you can add storage to these systems. You also can add volume encryption much quicker than a standard encryption on a database. So as an example, if you use encryption on a SQL environment, you can do this, but I have to rely on the database engineers, like we talked about before, to be able to enable that for me. I can't just go do it. Whereas if I am managing my virtual environment through AWS, I can actually turn on the overall volume encryption by myself. Now, the downside of this comes into is that if I don't know what are the ramifications of doing that, I could actually cause myself a little bit of headache, and then I have to troubleshoot why I put the encryption on, but why are things breaking? So you still need these database folks to help you with that, but it's much more useful and easier for me just to actually turn the security tools on versus just letting someone else do that for me. Now we're going to get into file storage. This is where you have network file systems, or NFS. This is where you can mount storage over your specific network. And it does allow the network to be as that conduit to store this information. That's a really cool option. Now you have this right now, right? If you look at networking, you're probably going, yawn, I've done network file storage forever. Well, you have, and it's been stuck within your own network in most cases, not always, but in most cases. Here it's the same concept, but now it's done and it's scattered across your overall virtual environment. So it's great. The downside is, though, from a security standpoint, the more network file systems that you have, the more places you're storing data, now the harder it becomes to secure and to know where all that data is going. So there's a downside to that. The server message block, this is also a Windows-based network file storage system, and that SMB is something you've dealt with as it relates to standard networking, most likely, but you get that same capability with the cloud. So now we're going to talk about hybrid and multi-cloud networking. So what is that? So when you have a direct connect, what this deals with AWS, so if you have an environment that's, say, your machine shop in somewhere, you can have a direct connect with AWS, which basically means anything that I drop on my network within my environment, within my little machine shop, will automatically get pushed to the AWS environment. That's a direct connect. Azure calls it express route, but basically what it comes right down to is it bypasses, you have two different options. You have a private peering and you have a public peering. The private peering will bypass the public internet and goes directly, you have a direct connection from your house or from your machine shop to the AWS servers. There's a public peering where it will access these same cloud services over the internet that are on a dedicated link. So the whole point of it comes into is if you want to have it private, you would have a direct connect that's a private link to AWS. Then you have a public, more or less a public link, used it with over the internet to AWS. each of those, the standard default would be the public peering. If you want a private network, then you will have to pay for it. But there is the ability for you to do that. And so it's just, you keep that in mind as you're looking at your overall costs. And that's considered what they call a hybrid environment. So when you have that direct connect, they consider that a hybrid environment. Now, if you have a multi-cloud, well, so let's say, for instance, you have a cloud between AWS and you have a cloud that is with Azure. If you have these clouds set up, then what will happen is that you can actually transfer data between these various clouds. Now, if you do that, there is some cost that's associated with it. And there's some optimization techniques that you will have to occur to do that. That isn't as simple as I want to connect my AWS environment to my Azure environment, and if they talk the same, they go, everything's the same, giddy up. Now, relatively speaking, it is relatively easy to connect the two. However, there are some costs that can be associated, and there's some potential optimizations that you would need to take care of and put in place to make that happen. But again, bottom line is it's not as difficult as it may seem to be, but there will be some aspects you'll have to work through. Now, when we deal with cloud network security, there is a different kinds of models that we'll talk about. There's a cloud network security model, which is a shared responsibility model. And this is where the cloud provider shares the same responsibility. You have network infrastructure, it gives you basic security controls, etc. And that the cool part about the shared responsibility model, I can't speak, sorry, is the fact that you push it off to the cloud. So if you have a situation where the cloud has to provide all of these aspects, your infrastructure, your security controls, and so forth, that is what the expectations are, and that is what they are supposed to do. When you're dealing with the customer's responsibility around this may be the fact that you are responsible to put in encryption. You're responsible to put in IAM, or identity and access management. That is your responsibility. The cloud doesn't, the AWS provider of the world, right? They are not responsible for that information. Now, they may provide that for you and they may be able to help you set it up, but if you don't want it, they're not going to put it in place for you just because of the added complexity and cost that goes with it. So it's important for you to understand what is the cloud's responsibility and what is the infrastructure or the company's responsibility. So as you're looking at these questions for the CISSP, think about that. And you want to make sure that you understand the differences between what is AWS's responsibility and Azure, and what is your responsibility as the person deploying it. Another thing to think about is a cloud security posture management. What it's called a CSPM. That's Charlie Sierra Papa Management. I can't think what M is. Mike. It has something mango. It's not mango. Well, it could be a mango, but no. So Charlie Sierra Papa Mango. The mango part of this. So when you're doing configuration audits, it will help you with your overall security posture of your company and of your AWS deployment. And that's a really great thing, especially when you're dealing with compliance and auditing and assessing. So having that ability to do that is really important. It also will help you with compliance monitoring to ensure you're meeting regulations such as GDPR and HIPAA. So the CSPM is a good add-on to be able to do that. And there's also companies out there that will help you just even get that started and set up. But the CSPM is a really good way to help from a compliance/audit assessment capability. Now, we talked about different types of service endpoints. You have public endpoints, you have private endpoints. So when you're dealing with an endpoint, what a public endpoint is, this allows you to access data over the internet. Now, it's the basics of public services and how they are potentially accessed. Now, the problem when you're dealing with a public endpoint is that there are risks associated with them. You have man-in-the-middle attacks that could be a potential risk that you may have to deal with. So it's important for you to understand any sort of endpoint that you put out on the internet, you ensure that if it has to be a public endpoint, the same kind of issues you come into when you have a web application or some sort of web application service of some kind, you would have people have access to it through the public internet. So it's just important for you to understand, if you're putting an endpoint out there, a public endpoint, what exactly is it and what are you exposing? Private endpoints, these are basically internal network access. These are accessible through your VPC. The good thing about this is they are available internally to your network and they are relatively secure. The bad part is they're not available to the world. So you have to decide, is the private endpoint something I want, or is it a public endpoint that I want? The private endpoint are secure, and those are aspects that you will want to determine. If my data is staying within my network and my data is to communicate with the cloud, then that system would be staying inside, and so therefore it would be private. But if I have individuals that are accessing this data from around the globe, then I would want to consider a public endpoint. Okay, so how do service endpoints work? So when we're dealing with endpoints, these service endpoints are endpoints that are actually communicating, providing services for you. Now, the service endpoint, if you have with packet flow and you have data that's moving to and from a routed endpoint, that will have the source and destination that's tied to it. It's the same as you deal with any sort of IP, other IP networking, is that you have a source and you have a destination, and then you have the data that's transmitted between those two destinations, between those 2 points. You also have routing tables, which provide you a static and dynamic routing. And these endpoints, you can configure this routing to be very similar to you would be able to do on a firewall. The point of this is that each of these will affect the overall routing table. So you could, like I said, you can get very granular so that these two systems, these two endpoints can talk to each other. And maybe that's a static route where this is a specific IP address to another specific IP address, and only those two can communicate. Or you can get very Gucci and have dynamic routing in place where one device, one endpoint can talk to many, or can talk to whatever endpoints actually pop up. You get into this especially when you're dealing with IoT, which is your Internet of Things. That can get really complex if you start getting into granular routing tables. And you can make your IoT environment extremely tight, but it does take a lot of management to be able to do that. And so the same thing with this. Any endpoint that you work with, you can get very granular with it, or you can make it much more open and broad. You just have to decide how much level of risk are you willing to accept when you do that. You also can get DNS resolution through the service endpoints. You can provide custom DNS names, which is your domain name service, and these names can be mapped to specific service endpoints themselves. So you can have a DNS name that's set up for Sean.Gerber Sean@Sean.com, whatever you want to say. And that service could be, if you make a service name, scratch your nose at Sean.Gerber.com. And that scratch your nose will actually, when you hit that, will run a Lambda function or run something on a specific endpoint. So you can get very customized with your DNS names. can these are things that you could typically do in your normal networking environment, but I have to bring in a plethora of people to help me do that. So you can configure all of this on your own. So I'm going to give you just one use case around a public service endpoint and how that would work within a cloud database. And this can happen. You have a public service endpoint that's out there accessing a cloud database from any specific location. So how would this set up? You have your initial setup, and your public endpoint would be set up for an AWS RDS instance. So what that means is your AWS RDS, that's Romeo Delta Sierra, is your relational database service. And it's the same as your SQL, MySQL. It's just a database environment. So you'd set up a public endpoint specifically to tie into this RDS environment. And then you'd set up your DNS resolution would be a setup specifically for this public endpoint, such as mydb-instance.12345678910, whatever you want to, whatever, .us.east. .1.rds.aws. Blah, blah, blah. It's a big long instance. If you go check out my site, you'll be able to see this specific use case called out intentionally. And the point of it is, though, is you find that DNS name. Now that DNS name is specifically designed for that RDS endpoint. Now, from a configuration standpoint, you would then set up firewall rules. I can't say that. Firewall rules to allow incoming traffic from specific IP addresses or IP address names. And only those would be allowed to access that specific cloud database. Then accessing that database, the user of the application would then access the database by connecting to the public endpoint DNS. So they'd have the DNS, they know the name, they don't know the IP address, but they know the name, and they would connect to that. And then once they connect to that, that would automatically point them to that cloud environment. And that's where the internet traffic goes through your AWS network and the firewall before reaching the RDS instance. So it's about a 5-step process. And it's relatively easy to do. So the great part about this is you can do this as your own. Now, as a security professional, you're going, what am I supposed to know with all of this? The bottom line with this is that you need to understand how it works. Do you need to understand the super nuances of it? No, I don't understand all the super nuances of the AWS environment. I will tell you though, that's one of the goals that I have in the rest of my career is really try to understand AWS. I have not dedicated enough time to it, and it's something I want to do more of. And therefore, I would recommend you pick something and go with it. But there's so much training out there available for you today on YouTube and other areas that you can really get smart on it in a way that will help you become more conversational, especially if your network people are starting to put this in place. When you deal with security for AWS, there's a lot of different areas that you can have access to. And what will end up happening is we're just going to focus on a couple just for this podcast and for this video. One is identifying identity and access management. And this is based on role-based access controls. And role-based access controls are how permissions are set specifically on the endpoint. So the endpoint may have it where only one certain type of role can access the data, and that's how the roles are set up. You can do this with IAM, and you can configure IAM within your AWS environment, and it's relatively easy. Another one is firewall rules, which we've kind of already talked about today, is as it relates to how do you configure those rules, allowing specific IPs to access these endpoints. This can be done through IP whitelisting and through port restrictions. So you can have specific IPs can access the endpoints, and then you also can limit the range of what are the accessible ports that can gain access through the firewalls. So there's a lot of areas you can do, a lot of granular connections you can make within the AWS environment. So I highly recommend you kind of go check that out as well. But those are some of the security measures. Now there's many more that you can do, but those are the basics, right? You have your IAM, your roles, and then you have set up your firewall rules to allow IPs communicating between the various environments. You can also set up Lambda functions, which with AWS, they call it Lambda, but it's basically a script that will trigger in the event something happens. So it's an if this, then that kind of thing. The Lambda function can trip. Now, you have integration with services. You can integrate with databases, SQL, NoSQL. You can do all of those aspects. You can integrate with other types of relational databases that are out there. AWS has a plethora of databases that you can connect to. You can use their own RDS environment as well. They have storage services, which you have object, block, and file storage, which we kind of talked about already. They have APIs. They have the RESTful API. And if you're not familiar with what a RESTful API is, it's basically an API that when anything is posted to that API, it automatically runs. So it's how you can define those APIs. That's the RESTful state. But it also, you can secure them based on how you integrate with your RESTful APIs. I just know enough to be really dangerous with RESTful APIs, just talking to some of my developers. But at the end of the day, there's a lot you can do just from an API standpoint. Now, from a security standpoint, I would say APIs are one of my biggest concerns, and they should be yours as well, just because there's so many ways you can. In the past, you had only certain VPNs and connections into your environment. Now you have all these APIs, you're adding more and more connections into your environment. And in many cases, people don't have good visibility into what is actually coming and going out of their environment. Next one is serverless architecture. You have functional endpoints. These are triggering a serverless function, which basically means a script. It doesn't need a full up server to run this capability. Now, a script is probably a little bit too generic. A script is just a couple kilobytes of data and you run it. This is, you can, instead of having an entire server designed to run maybe a small couple processes, you now can just run these processes, and it utilizes a certain percentage of the overall server to run these processes. So it's a step beyond a script, but it's kind of like a script. But there you have that overall serverless architecture is a very helpful part. And then the various use cases we kind of talked about, again, where you have hybrid cloud scenarios, and then you also have multi-cloud deployments. You can interconnecting of the clouds can occur very, very easily, and you can have endpoints that can communicate between these clouds. However, keep in mind the costs associated with intercloud connectivity can go up quite substantially, especially if you're dealing with any sort of data replication between one cloud and another. You really got to watch your expenses because it can get out of hand very fast. All right, that's all I've got for today. I hope you guys had a wonderful experience, and I hope you learned a lot about Cloud Essentials as it relates to the CISSP. Go check everything out at CISSPcybertraining.com. You can get access to my free CISSP questions. Just go to freeCISSPquestions.com, and you can get some access to those. Also, just go to CISSP Cyber Training, and you can get access to all of this content. I have $1 free trials that are $1 trials that are set up to try out the content. Just spend $1. You can go check it out, see if you like it. If you don't, just cancel. It's not a big deal. But there's all of this data information is available for you. The best thing about this CISSP training over other of my competitors out there, I'm just going to be honest, I'm giving you the expertise from a CISO that someone has dealt with all of these aspects. I can help you. And it's more than just learning to pass the CISSP exam. You are actually going to get the information you need to be successful in the role and learn what you need to learn to be able to be that CISO or to be that director of IT security or just lead whatever you want to be as it relates to security in your environment. I've been there, done that. I got the t-shirt. I can help you. So just check it out, CISSPcybertraining.com, and go and see what we can help you with. All right, we'll catch you on the flip side. See ya.